available to people if you have any requests at the end as well. So welcome once again to Recovery and Resilience with Professor Lisa Gibbs, our keynote today. She is the Director of the Child and Community Wellbeing Program in the Centre for Health Equity, Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. And Professor Gibbs has worked on a number of different articles, and you would have seen some headlines perhaps around the work that she has been doing with the Royal Commission into national natural disaster arrangements. She has written extensively on disaster recovery, and her research extends into children's health and wellbeing, and also into school leadership and how we manage with disaster recovery in schools. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome her today. She has also written about something that's very exciting, and this is was really exciting. I was going to put this on Twitter last night, and I thought, oh, you know, calm down. But it's very, very exciting. So this new concept of transilience, when I was reading her work, so transilience is defined as leaping or passing from one thing or state to another. It offers the most positive way to promote health and well-being by reflecting and actively choosing the practices we carry forward. It also infers an agility and flexibility required to make such transitions. Now, when I read that, I just couldn't help but feel so positive about what we can do, because we can't change much about the situation at the moment with the pandemic, but what we can do is believe in this new approach, this transilience approach, by keeping you know, what's good and moving forward that way. So I'm very grateful that I found that was very exciting. And also Lisa is also an author. She writes children's books, and one of the inspirations for me of asking Lisa to come and speak today was that I had seen lots of different media images on the television earlier this year around climate change and disaster, you know, extinction events and so on and so forth. And I wondered, you know, how families were dealing with and how teachers were dealing with young children seeing these images in the media. This was before the pandemic. And so children's books do send a lot of really positive messages. And when I discovered that Lisa was also an author, I thought I've got to include that as well as one of the slides. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Lisa, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And welcome, Lisa. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Celia. And that makes me laugh. You've obviously been Googling me.
I have.
So I won't be able to, well, I hadn't prepared to speak about transilience today or about my books, but we can always do that in questions if people are interested. And I did want to acknowledge a co-author for this presentation, my colleague Jane Nursey at Phoenix, Australia, the Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health. There's some shared work we've been doing in this space, and in fact there's so many people who have been working on this research and the knowledge translation that there's too many to mention here, but if people are interested in following up on any of the resources, you'll see the contributors acknowledged there. I did want to also note, as Celia said, that I will pause about halfway through the presentation just to sort of catch up if there's any questions that need to be addressed, and then again at the end, and I'll try and move through at a reasonable pace to allow space for a bit more discussion. But I suspect you're sitting there wondering what on earth is this photo about. So I'll start by describing this, and I love this image. I use it a lot because, well, let me tell you the story. These two boys in here who are performing are friends of our family, and they've given me permission to use this image. And they had just evacuated with their mother from the fires that occurred earlier this year. And so they were stuck at the Bega showgrounds for days waiting to see what happened with the fires. And because they'd packed up the house in the station wagon, they had their performing gear with them because they perform at festivals. Their performing name is Brothers on Fire, which was a bit unfortunate in the circumstances they were in. But they thought, well, everyone here is waiting. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of boredom. So they put on a performance and entertained people, and then over the course of the days ran workshops in circus arts and juggling and things like that. And the reason I included is I just think it's so important when we worry about protecting our students and children that we don't lose sight of the fact of how capable they are and the contribution that they can make to helping us all get through this. And there's been some lovely examples during the pandemic of incredible initiatives that young people have been showing. So let's keep that in mind, and also remember that while we talk about the impacts, most people do adjust and cope with adversity. And that's an important reminder, while we also recognise that these events do increase the risk of mental health issues and impact on wellbeing. So, this is weird, my slides are not, oh, here we go. So just to give you a sense of what we'll cover, I'll start with the community context that occurs in the aftermath of a disaster and impacts on the school community, because the school community is the focus of today's discussion. And then I'll talk about, well, what's happening within the school, and then look specifically at students and support options for students, and then impacts on staff and support options for staff. Just acknowledging that we only have less than an hour. So we're not going to be able to go into anything in depth. The point of this is to give you a sense of what's out there and where you might be able to draw extra support from. A lot of this research comes from one of our major studies, the Beyond Bushfires study, which ended up extending for 10 years following the Black Saturday bushfires that occurred in Victoria in 2009. And of course, I'm assuming that most of you will remember that that was a catastrophic event, and before the most recent summer fires were considered to be the worst fire event that we've had in Australia. And we really focused on mental health and wellbeing in the aftermath of that event, and there's been a number of related studies that have come off that. So I guess the starting point is to acknowledge the increased risk of mental health disorders following what will be experienced by many as a traumatic event. So this is following a fire event, the Black Saturday bushfires, and we found that 3 to 4 years later, people who were in the most highly impacted communities, about a quarter of them, or just over a quarter of them, were showing signs and symptoms of diagnosable mental health disorders. So that was twice what we were seeing in the low or no impact communities, and really was at the end of the continuum of impact, because there were many people who were affected in all sorts of ways, whether it was feeling distressed on a hot, windy day, or having days where they just couldn't get out of bed to go to work or to study, relationship strain. These figures talk about the end of that continuum where people are reporting quite severe effects. And when we followed that up at 5 and then 10 years, we found that for about a fifth of the members of high impact communities, or in our participant sample, that was still evident 10 years later. And the most likelihood of that being a continuing effect was if people were dealing with additional stresses after the event. And the disruption that occurs after these major emergency events includes loss of income, change of accommodation, relationship breakdown, loss of employment. All of these major stresses really undermine people's capacity to get back on track. And they're a particular feature of major emergency events. So what we wanted to do was to understand what might be risk and protective factors that can guide us in terms of responding to these events. And the reason I'm talking about this is because these are all part of the broader community context that the school communities are situated within. And although I'm talking here specifically about bushfires, and that's very relevant to the communities affected in this year's fires, we also know that the human impacts of major emergency events are actually quite consistent, even though the practical effects of the different types of hazards can vary quite a lot, whether it's fire or flood, earthquake, cyclone, pandemic. Sure, on a practical level it varies, but the human impacts can be quite similar. And one of the things that we found was an increased risk of violence for women in the fire-affected communities. And the particular analysis that I'm reporting on here didn't distinguish on whether that was domestic violence or experiences of violence in the broader community, but most likely the majority of that would have been partner violence. And so when we were advising government in the wake of this year's bushfires in terms of what support could be provided to school communities, we were also talking about the need for access to experts in prevention and support for family violence. But there were protective factors as well. And one of those was if people belong to a local community group or organisation. That was actually a really strong effect that we would see better mental health and wellbeing outcomes years after the disaster if people had that involvement in local groups. And of course, the school community operates very much like a local community hub and has a really important role in bringing people together, sharing information, sharing support. But of course, the importance of being connected and supporting each other is really compromised when we're living through an event that requires us to stay apart. And it really is a complicated process then for how do we maintain those connections and maintain that support under these conditions. One of the things that we found in the school community after a disaster event was that there was a real shift in the focus of what was needed for students. So the school is clearly a learning environment and obviously has a responsibility to care for students and maintain their well-being, but the central focus and purpose is learning. We saw this really shift after a disaster event where the primary focus was on maintaining well-being and trying to manage to continue learning around the edges of that, if you like. So that's a real challenge for school staff to adjust to that. And of course, in the current pandemic situation, the additional challenge of having to work sometimes outside of the school building, sometimes in, and probably the most challenging is when you're trying to do both. So just thinking about the students at the moment, well, this is true for everyone, but I'm sort of focusing on students, is just to remember that it's really normal to show stress reactions when you're going through or have just gone through an abnormal experience. That's a human response to what's happened, and it can manifest in many different ways. And in fact, we would expect it to vary quite considerably across our students and for us as adults as well. And so it may become evident through guilt, grief, anger, problems managing emotions that might be expressed through difficult behaviour or evident in a student becoming very withdrawn. Kids might be restless, have difficulty concentrating, they might feel sick, they might have headaches, they might just disengage from school altogether. They might worry a lot about their safety or the safety of others. They may have difficulty sleeping, so they might have trouble getting to sleep, or they might sleep more. There might be a different understanding of how the world works and where they fit within that. there may be risk-taking behaviour, and there may be development of mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are just some of the variety of things that can happen. So I guess the point is that anything that's where we're seeing difficulties or changes for our students is likely to be coming from the effect of the event or the emergency event that they've experienced. And that can extend over time, but for the majority, it's in the early stages, the first 3 months. And we see common trajectories after trauma. There are some who just seem to be remarkably resilient and cope all the way through. The most common reaction is the purple line you can see here, where there's expressions of distress and difficulties, but then people get on track, you know, after a few weeks or months after the event's been experienced. And obviously, with this sort of experience with the pandemic, where it's not a single event occurring and then recovery, it really complicates these trajectories, because really we're still in the response phase. And so these timescales become less predictable. The other scenario is that there can be a delayed reaction. So children can cope in the early stages and then just run out of steam, if you like, and other stresses undermine their capacity to maintain that resilience. And so there's a delayed reaction. And for others, they really struggle with what's happened and can't seem to get past that. And for those students, we would suggest they need additional professional support to cope with that. And in fact, it's quite useful to use this stepped care model, where we think of a tiered approach. And at the top, you would expect there'll be some students, some adults who will show real difficulties over time and will need professional support. There'll be others who will benefit from assistance to deal with the distress and to process what's happened. And if they receive that, then it's not likely to escalate into anything more serious. And then the vast majority will benefit from what is essentially psychological first aid. So just advice, support, understanding for what people are going through to enable them to get through that period and back on track. And actually, these are the core principles that underline that notion of psychological first aid. It was identified more than a decade ago, well supported by the evidence, and now in practice. And I find it really helpful to look at these, because when I look at these, I think I get this, I know what this means. I know there are strategies I can use without expertise that could address these issues. So one is restoring a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of self and community efficacy. So that notion that you, the individual, they know they can deal with what is happening, and there's security in the sense that the school community, the family, the country is also dealing with it. That sense of connectedness that I spoke about is a really important part of that. And when we think of our students not in school and missing that connectedness with their peers and their teachers, that's a really important aspect that needs to be considered. And of course, for those students who have gone through the bushfires and the pandemic, they're at particular risk and particularly in need of these strategies. And the final one is a sense of hope. A sense of hope that things will improve, that will get easier. And so sometimes it's about shifting the gaze, not to the next day or the next week, but next year when we're able to do this, but also feeling as if we can cope with the now. When we're looking at the impacts of remote learning and school disruptions, it's really difficult to give you, I can't give you a definitive answer or guidance on what's likely to happen, because we simply have never experienced something on this scale before. But we can draw from the evidence about disaster impacts, about missing school and school absences and so on. And the evidence suggests that distance learning can be effective if it's high quality. And obviously there's a difference between well-developed distance programs and that scramble to shift to remote learning. But clear explanations, scaffolding, feedback, there's evidence to suggest that the students will still learn. They may not learn as much, but their learning will still progress. We know that in terms of capacity to adjust to change, the majority of students will adjust and will cope with the disruptions that have taken place. The capacity to learn remotely may vary based on the age of the students and the subject that they're learning, but there's still not clear patterns in the evidence to give you particular guidance on this. What we do know without question is that social disadvantage increases the risk of the learning loss through this period. And that's because it can affect the student's capacity to learn in many different ways. It might be simply that there's not adequate access to computers in the house, internet access. It might be the parents don't have the educational capacity to support their students' learning, or their own work commitments may compromise that, or they may be dealing with bushfire rebuilding and not able to also support student learning. So there's a whole range of different reasons, and obviously there are families who have existing trauma and risk issues that would affect that. And so that additional exposure to grief, loss and disruption is where we would expect to see an increased risk of poor mental health, well-being and learning, and also if there's existing mental health issues. But I guess it's really important to be conscious that not only with the remote learning, but with disaster effects in other ways, that people can experience growth as well. There can be increased connections with others and learning and new opportunities. And it's helpful to sort of focus on those aspects as well. We do know that there are potential impacts on learning from a major disaster event, and our own research has shown that after the Black Saturday bushfires, we followed the cohort of students who began prep in Victoria the year before the bushfires came through in 2009. And we found that those students who were from the areas affected by the bushfires just didn't progress in their learning to the same extent as their peers in reading and numeracy. So we followed them up to grade 5 and found that effect, and that was really of great concern. And so we engaged with Department of Education about that, and they commissioned us to follow the cohort then through to year 9. And what we found was that they got back on track in terms of their capacity to learn by about year 7. So reading first and then numeracy. But when we looked at where they were at in their academic scores from grade 5 through to year 9, that cohort were behind their peers in every academic domain. So the impact on learning initially just got them behind, and they never really caught up. So there are potential long-term effects. This isn't necessarily replicated in other international studies, so there's still a lot to learn here. So it means that we need to pay attention, but it's not conclusive in terms of what that will mean for the current students and the pandemic effects. But one of the things that we realised was that this cohort of students who started in prep, they're in year 12 this year. So these kids who started their school years with catastrophic fires are ending their school years with catastrophic fires and a pandemic. So there are year 11 and 12 students. So just something to be mindful of for those who are in the secondary sector. So, you know, what do we do about that? It's really easy to be overwhelmed. As I said before, be mindful of students' capacity So we need to provide social and emotional support, but also to engage them in that process, and opportunities for them to contribute can be really healing for them. In terms of learning, our research would indicate that maths and reading are particularly important areas to support, and maths came through in international studies as well as a risk subject. For our secondary school students, sometimes the academic trajectory they are on is altered by these life experiences. And so it's really important to think about the vocational supports as well as the academic supports, so that they're prepared for what comes after school. And recognising that those transitions, as you know, educational experts well know, the transitions into primary, from primary to secondary, and from secondary to tertiary or employment are particularly important times to be providing support. School engagement is an important part of this. We know that students who are probably at most risk of mental health issues are the ones who are less likely to be attending school. So after a disaster event, potentially not attending school, during remote learning, potentially not engaging with online classes. And so that's an area where for service providers, we need to be thinking about not just support within the school, but also support options provided in the community, the broader community. And recognising that trauma-informed practice is an area of expertise, and it's really important that schools have access to that expertise, and also, as I mentioned earlier, access to expertise around family violence in case that's an emerging issue within school communities. And just to, assure you that the evidence shows that school-based programs delivered to all students to affect emotional and social well-being are effective. They have been shown to reduce the incidence of mental illness in children and adolescents in post-disaster contexts. So have faith that, that you can make a difference. And the question is, which programs are most likely to be supportive? There's a lot of programs already in schools that are around supporting resilience, and useful also to consider those that have components that deal with trauma impacts. So we know that schools, particularly those schools in the bushfire affected areas, are likely to be being approached from all sides with programs to support students, programs to support staff. It's really hard to know which ones to go with. So the Department of Education asked us to help provide a tool, a checklist, something really simple to go through to help principals arrive at a choice, because there's no one size fits all. It has to be right for the school, the particular school community that we're talking about. So we've designed this appraisal tool for principals to go through and just note what is needed within their school, with consideration to factors likely to support recovery, and an appraisal tool for program providers so they can provide matching information to say, well, if these are your needs, this is how we would respond to that. This is how our program aligns with those needs. And we've just been advised that the Department of Education is happy for these tools to be widely publicly available. So we're just about to release those. There's also some lovely things around, and I just wanted to share this gorgeous children's book. A friend and colleague of mine in New Zealand who's worked with schools post earthquakes and now with the pandemic has written this series of books about Bear in lockdown, and they're just really, really sweet and quite funny for the adults reading them. So they've gone viral. So if anyone wanted to have a look at these books, you can see the link there. About 3 of them are on that site, and I expect Carol will load the rest soon. So I'll just pause there for a moment, one so I can do a bit of a time check, but also to see if there's any questions that have come up in the chat. I can't see the chat, so I'm relying on Celia to tell me if there's anything that I need to respond to at this stage.
Lisa, I think everybody has just been so focused on your words, your talking. I know myself, but I have had a look through the chat. I don't have any questions. We have lots of people from all over Victoria and all sorts of places. One query I have is, well, one thing that was very, very reassuring is that those students, it's the schools where there is any kind of program, you know, some support, that it does make an impact, depending on, it doesn't really matter. Teachers, even though they're not psychologists, can still support those that first aid, mental first aid is really important, isn't it? It is something that teachers don't really get much training in, but they can care, and they do care. So, but other than that, I don't have any more questions. I have someone here wanted to, is very much looking forward. So Terry's very much looking forward to seeing the appraise checklist, and it would be helpful to guide them in the direction of best practice.
Great.
And also seeing the Bear in Lockdown link, if we could have that posted into the chat. So we'll try and arrange that. Okay,
fabulous. And if people love them and they can't get the full series, just shoot me an email and I'll send them to you, because there's 4 in the first series, and Carol's now done and started a new series with a different bear. And they do quite make me laugh. All right, lovely, thanks for that. And look, I wouldn't suggest it doesn't matter what you do. It is about making sure it's they are appropriate strategies, but I do agree that, you know, teachers know how to care for their students, and so, you know, feel reassured that your skills are really important, and that there are programs that you can draw on to support that. And I guess I wanted to revisit this slide because it was a really important point, Celia, actually, that what is being asked of teachers in these disaster contexts. Because while there's this shift going on for students, which really does kind of often go beyond what teachers were trained to do, the boundaries of responsibility tend to extend as well, because what we find is that families are asking a lot more of teachers at this time than they normally would. We had one school principal after the Black Saturday bushfires who had evacuated herself from her home and was receiving calls from families asking her if they should evacuate. So, you know, I guess the role of the school is so important, and it is seen as a community hub and a source of information. And so what can happen is principals and teachers are being asked for guidance about things that are not really part of what would traditionally be considered the teacher's role. And this is a real responsibility and a strain, particularly if teachers are going through the event themselves, but also because they care about their students and their families. And so there's vicarious trauma that can happen. And what we found was that this does increase the risk of school staff experiencing mental health effects themselves. And yet there is a tendency to prioritise the needs of students and families above their own self-care. And this quote you can see where someone has said, it's so hard to do when you're thrust into that position, because you know you should be looking after yourself, but you know your prime thing is to look after everybody else. And this was a real pattern that we saw, and something that we're concerned about and conducting research into at the moment, to really start to, I guess, highlight that risk for staff and to try and advocate for the importance of supporting staff at these times. And so, in fact, we've been doing that quite strongly all through this year, making recommendations at a national and a state level about the need for intensive staff support programs before students return to school. So opportunities for staff to gather themselves before they're dealing with the needs of students, because there is a recognition that students benefit from a return to routine and a safe, familiar place, but we need to enable staff to do that in a way that is safe for them as well. And we're advocating that these sorts of support sessions need to be delivered at regular intervals, because the issues that are being dealt with tend to evolve over time as the event itself progresses, or the recovery period progresses. And also to have some guidance about what resources can be provided to families, because there is advice being sought from families, and so it's helpful if schools can be provided with resources to give families. Obviously, the needs of staff need to be monitored and wellbeing checks offered. We do know that staff, and actually we find with other frontline workers, are sometimes reluctant to identify as needing support because they don't want to be taken off the job. And so support in place is a really important concept to enable people to continue in the role if that is what they want to do and if they're able to do that. And part of the capacity to do that is some flexibility around the normal administrative meeting reporting requirements that are part of any organisation. And sometimes what can happen is, for those who are removed from the impacts, there's not that recognition that flexibility is required, and that's why we've been advocating for that from our position as disaster researchers and advisors. And the other thing we recommend from a systemic point of view and at school level is to think about how extra staff can come on board to enable the school to address the additional needs that are there. And that may be retired teachers, it may be student teachers, it may be parents with particular skills, but people who can provide, who can deal with some of the additional tasks, enabling teachers to be there for students and fulfil their core role. So that's, I think, really important, is what has to happen at that systemic level. But the reality is, as for students, we also want to ensure that teachers are engaging in self-care as much as they possibly can, because they're not immune to the impacts of stress and trauma and burnout. And you can't care and provide effective support for others if you're struggling yourself. And just recognising that that can change from day to day, and it can depend on how your students and family are coping from day to day. And so it requires monitoring and attention, and recognising it will fluctuate and having strategies for dealing with that, and allowing space for yourself, but also for others that you're working with, to step away from time to time. And look, there are early warning signs that we can probably recognise in others more than we often do in ourselves. So just that, you know, being really irritable can be a sign that things are getting to you. Behavioural changes, so the things that would normally be part of routine and feeling and being healthy are being neglected. So exercise, sleeping, eating habits, drinking habits, just finding that things are mounting up, but also withdrawing from things that you normally would enjoy, and so not getting the benefit then of those social connections. You know, there's a fantastic psychologist, trauma psychologist in the field, who many of you will know, called Rob Gordon, and he always talks about making sure that you build into your life leisure and pleasure, because it's really easy at these times to get overtaken by work commitments and caring for others. So part of the self-care strategy is becoming aware of your own reactions and acknowledging them. Sometimes just acknowledging them is part of the release. Having some techniques that help you keep calm and allowing yourself time to heal. Don't expect yourself to be on top of everything and to be superhuman, because we're all affected by what's going on. And recognise the value in connecting with others, talking with others, engaging in healthy behaviours and maintaining those regular routines, and just being wary. You know, alcohol and other drugs provide some temporary relief, but can actually add to the problems and in the experience of stress. And I just want to go back to the findings that I presented right at the start about the importance of those social connections. So our research shows that being close to more people is generally related to better mental health and wellbeing outcomes. This was true after the Black Saturday bushfires in our research, but we're now seeing it emerging in research internationally, the social capital is just such an essential part of how we deal with these events. But also the strong attachment to the natural environment. We found in our research, when we spoke to people about how they were coping, and we expected them, to be honest, to talk about connections to people, they started showing us the local bush and how they were affected by that and how they drew on that. And so we went back to our research findings, our quantitative findings, and found that strong attachment to the natural environment was associated with better mental health and well-being in every measure we looked at. And there's strong evidence in the literature about the connection between nature and health. And I would imagine that all of you, like me, have discovered during lockdown how much you need to get outside and just see trees and flowers and fresh air, experience fresh air. So just remembering that we draw on that natural environment as a recovery. And so I guess, you know, with a very brief overview, the takeaway messages really are, sure, self-care strategies are very important, and being aware what works for you, being kind to others and allowing them to have bad days, to have reactions that may not be helpful for you to deal with, but are a reflection of stress and trauma. And making sure that we're conscious of the ways the systems and organisations can contribute to our capacity to take care of ourselves and to care for others. And so here are some resources that may be useful. The first one is one we put together with Red Cross, because there's so many resources out there for children and parents that it's hard to navigate through them. So this is really a list of what's out there and for what purpose. And then this second link is one that was set up particularly for school staff around the use of the arts, and people may find that one useful. So I'll stop there. You can see that my email address is there, and also our website where we post our disaster-related research. And anyone's welcome to go there. But happy, if there's any time left, to answer any questions. Thanks, Celia.
Thank you, Lisa. That's terrific. Yes, we do have some questions. I'd like to start with a question from Julian. Julian says, with 2 months of continuous fires surrounding our town of Braidwood, we then had only 2 weeks between this and COVID. We are observing very inconsistent effects on student learning and teacher wellbeing. Is there any data or research on shorter term impacts? In terms of trauma on students, I suppose there's no point asking you, Celia. Julian,
yes.
Would you be happy to come online? I can't, if you could turn your camera on and wave to me, I can, there you are. Would you like to unmute and ask that question?
Hi there.
Hi, Julian.
I can't see me. I don't know if you can
see me. Hi, Julian. Yep, I can see you.
We can see and hear you, yeah.
This should be working.
Yes, it's working.
We can see you. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we've lost the sound. Yeah.
I think it looks like Julian couldn't hear us, so I might just try and respond. The first is that I've been advocating very strongly for during the COVID responses to be mindful of the additional impacts on bushfire effect. Oh, hang on, I'm worried that Julian can't hear my response to his question.
Hi there. Sorry, no, I couldn't hear you for some reason, but it's come through.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay, you go ahead.
Look, we've had an interesting kind of response, and obviously everyone's been at different times. My question is, well, for some students, we've seen real growth regardless of everything, and particularly for where the teacher has sort of forged ahead regardless. But then other students completely different, much harder for Kinder 1, obviously, with that online time. I just think that shorter term, it seems so inconsistent. I can't get a gauge, and I'm just wondering if you've got any insights about that.
I would certainly expect to see that variability at any stage of the recovery process, because that's just part of it. And sometimes the growth can happen alongside distress. Sometimes the intensity of the experience, even if it can be really difficult and challenging, can also be accompanied by an experience of growth and learning. The resource materials that I shared on the slide earlier, I can go back to that, include guidance around providing support in the short term. So there's definitely knowledge and expertise out there about how to provide support post-trauma for children. We are absolutely advocating in this COVID time for the additional stresses for families and schools affected by bushfires, but we're hampered by the fact that we're not allowed to do research through the school system, and that's a real difficulty for us. But and I know that when a disaster happens, there's a lot of requests that will come through town for engagement in research, and it's probably the last thing people want to do. But it is an opportunity to raise awareness of impacts and contribute to knowledge. And so it's something to consider in those communities. But, you know, that's obviously a very personal choice. Not sure if that answers your question, Julian.
No, they've got, look, it's, I think I'd be interested in talking to a bit further after this, but because we've had those, some families have had flood and fire and the as well. So it's been quite ongoing. We had two main goals, was to maintain connection and maintain community through that COVID period. That was the established purpose. And that was the hardest thing. I was interested to see your flowchart that, you know, that community focus is so important, but how we did that, I don't think was as strong as it would be normally. But anyway, I'll stop talking. Thanks, Viv. No,
it's a real challenge. Very happy to have a chat separately.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Just a query from Paula, Lisa, around students performing lower than their peers 5 to 7 years later. Was that, where are you, Paula? Would you like to ask that question? I can see you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, my query was the comment you made that after the disasters there was a shift from learning to well-being, and whether that contributed to those results you were seeing, that students who'd had that experience were performing lower than their peers.
Look, what we know tends to happen is that there are neuropsychological impacts from the trauma for many students, and so their capacity to concentrate can be affected, their capacity to retain learning can be affected, and to process the learning. And so there's a whole lot of different ways that their learning is likely to be compromised. If they're distressed, they clearly can't sit and listen to a lesson. There's also likely to be disruption happening in the home and in their community. So if the parents are dealing with rebuilding and they're living in a caravan or a tent, you know, time to support homework or reading. They might have lost all the children's books. There's so many different layers of impact that we see in these disaster settings that compromise learning. So just to note that was statewide data. So that does not mean every student gets behind. Yeah. It just means we see a pattern of risk that we need to be aware of. And, you know, all credit to the Department of Education and you know, ministers and officials across Australia. We were